thing. So he thrust out one hand and touched his fingers to the wall, scuffing his fingertips over its rough-hewn surface. Every now and then, he would call out again, mainly because he couldn't bear the silence or the distant noises that sometimes broke it apart. "Hello? Is anyone there? I need help!" At that moment, his stomach growled so loudly that it made him jump. And then, as he was laughing shakily at his own foolishness, the ground under his feet vanished, and he dropped, sickeningly, arms flailing, only to hit the stone floor a moment later. He lay where he fell for a few minutes, crying with pain and shock. Eventually he realised that here the darkness was not so solid, and he could see a little better. Farther up the tunnel, there was another set of candles, and their thin, buttery light just about reached him. The small set of steps that he'd fallen down from was a couple of feet away, and on the edge of one step was a dark dash of blood where he'd bashed his knee. Slowly, Robbie uncurled himself and got back on his feet, wiping one grimy arm across his face again. "Bloody stupid steps!" He hiccuped. Then his stomach growled again. He limped up the tunnel, his knees throbbing, heading toward the next set of candles, when he saw that there was something sitting on the floor beneath the candles, something shockingly red and wet and glistening. He approached cautiously, but once he got into the warm circle of light, he realised he knew what it was. It was one of the weird fruits that Jill sometimes picked up from the Turkish food centre. She seemed to like to find things that he hadn't seen before, which was, Robbie had to admit, not exactly difficult. In his old home, they had considered bananas exotic enough. This was a pomegranate, cut in half so that the crimson, jewel-like seeds were spilling out. His stomach roared at the sight of it. He'd picked it up and had his fingers wedged into the partitions before it occurred to him that it was weird to find a pomegranate here. That someone had to have placed it underneath the candles, and recently too. He held up a rough handful of juicy seeds, his fingers already stained pink, and looked out into the dark again. "Is anyone there? Hello?" There was a distant sigh, the wind moving down the corridor again, and then nothing. A tiny voice in his head, some half-remembered ancient instinct, was telling him that the food was dangerous, that it was a trap. "Too good to be true," it whispered, this voice from the bad old days. "Eat this, and you'll never be allowed to leave." But the voice was crushed beneath Robbie's persistent hunger. He sat down under the candles and ate the first handful of seeds, his mouth filling with their sweet, tart juice. He crunched the tiny, gritty pips between his teeth. As he was popping more of the seeds out of the pomegranate, he noticed that he hadn't grazed his knees after all. In fact, he hadn't broken his skin anywhere. But his white shift was smeared with blood, big wet patches of it, as though he'd rolled around in it or fallen into a puddle. He looked up, seeking out the steps where he'd seen the smudge of blood, and that was when he saw the shadowy shape moving in the dark, coming toward him. It reached out its hand, and Robbie screamed. Chapter 1. Is the name John important to anyone here? Ashley Whitelam let her gaze flicker out across the audience. It was one of the smaller nights at the Working Men's Club, only around 60 punters or thereabouts, so it didn't take long. She saw a handful of faces brighten, eyebrows raising, hands clutching handbags. Ashley felt as though she really could read their minds. Does she mean my John? Surely not my own John. Thanks to her brother Aidan's quiet voice in her ear, she already knew who she was looking for. Now, what I get when John is coming through is a sense of tightness here. Ashley pressed one hand to her chest, her eyes half closed. She wasn't focused directly on the audience, but she could see hands rising hesitantly into the air. This John, perhaps he had problems with his heart or his lungs later in life.